So, Michael, we are talking about Kubernetes a lot in regard to developer productivity. And what we see is that security is a big aspect when it comes to developer productivity because we've just seen the number of CVEs double over the past year. Why do you think that is? Why is it such a challenge?
Well, there's two things in general. I think security is always a challenge, just because there's always people there for two reasons. One, because there's increasingly more people who are trying to break into your systems and do things, right? So there's that. But it is much different than when I was a young programmer in the late 90s and 2000s. There's a lot more going on there. But then I think also not specific, but part of the nature of Kubernetes and technology in general is that when you have a new technology like Kubernetes or something else, like you don't have it all fixed up. And then also you have like a ramp up of all sorts of people using it. So, if we use like the diffusion of innovation curve, early on, you have a bunch of very excited hyper nerds using it. But then as you go into more and more mainstream sort of enterprises, as I think you and I would say, then you just have wider use of it and more scenarios. And so I think it's, I forget what bias or whatever that is, but if there's more of it, there's going to be more of it.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is also the CNCF universe, as I like to call it. That large landscape map of all different categories of CNCF products. That has become huge.
Yeah, and that definitely and there's multiple options in each category, which is great. You've got like all sorts of things to choose from. But again, I think with security, it often comes back to at this stage in a technology, when you have so many options and so many new people using it, you just have more exposure. I guess that's a security term, right? You're more exposed out there. Then, in the later parts of the market, of any sort of market, there tends to be a coalescing around less things on that big chart that the CNCF has. And then also the technology just becomes mature. It stops evolving so much. People know how to use it and secure it, how to integrate it into what they have. So you get just like a better notion of what works and doesn't work and how to plug all the holes, and also the practices of ongoing plugging all those holes.
Right. And what we see is a lot of those holes are really in the neighborhood, in the environment that is not the core Kubernetes, but that is those things that belong to Kubernetes, like Argo had a couple of big ones, Flux, and a whole bunch of them, I believe, originate from those tools that people really like, but where they have a lot of choice and there's a lot of different versions out, and it's all open source. So you have to be on it to fix it all very quickly, or you have security issues in production.
Yeah, no, and you raise another good point about security in Kubernetes, and Kubernetes in general is, in a report of yours that you did recently that I was looking over. I remember there's one chart, I forget the page number, but there's one chart that's basically like the stack of Kubernetes, right? And when I looked at it, one of the thing that jumped out to me that made me, I don't know, think the most or react the most was that the actual like Kubernetes part of it was tiny compared to like all the other stuff around it, right? And so in this question of like Kubernetes security, and you were like raising this, you're making me think of it this way, it is worth saying like, well, if we just look at Kubernetes itself, like how secure or insecure is that versus like all this other stuff that you wrap around Kubernetes. And then, when you look at some of the tools you were mentioning and others, like a lot of insecure problems, a lot of security problems come in basically when the tool is fine, but like you're not using the tool in a secure way, right? So if you build the apps you're deploying, if you build the configuration wrong. So, I don't really know the numbers or whatever, but I would suspect that a lot of the security concerns that you have around a stack based on Kubernetes, to be very precise, have a lot more to do with how it's being used than just like, to use a silly metaphor, it's like if you're worried about a bucket leaking, there's a hole in the bucket or not, right? Like, whereas I think a lot of things when it comes to security and infrastructure is like, it's not clear if there's a hole. There's something else going on with how you're using the bucket. I'm going to get lost in my analogy there.
And there's also a lot of buckets. A lot of Kubernetes clusters.
That's right.
It's not just one. Initially, I remember maybe I misunderstood what they had in mind with Kubernetes, but I thought you have multi-tenancy in one cluster, and then you have everybody's apps there, and you isolate everything nicely. And it turns out, no, you generate really a whole bunch of clusters on a whole bunch of different clouds. And that has led also to a lot of issues. And if it was just human mistakes.
Yeah. No, and I think, exactly. You're describing it well, that there are many insecure ways to use Kubernetes and to, even more importantly, to like use all the stuff around it, right? And so like, and I think that also contributes back to your original question, right? Like as you're trying to fit this new kernel means something much more specific in our world, but as you're trying to fit this new core that's at the center of running your applications and doing other stuff, and kind of just like put all the new tools that are in there, it's figuring out how that stuff is integrated together, how it works with your existing stuff, how you've configured it, how you build it together. And, that's going to mean a lot of different like security things to review, right? And, whenever I talk with security people, I'm not a security person at all, but like, just to obligatorily bring in what they would say, they're always like, Coté. The CVEs aren't the big deal. It's the risk profiling and the policy, and which I don't know what that's all about. I'm sure it's valid, but that's a whole other thing that tends to, I think if you just look at a not simple, but just a kind of aggregate, for example, survey question about what an issue is, and people respond with security, they also mean like, well, when I go talk to the CISO people, they're like, fill out this spreadsheet, right? Or like schedule some meetings to talk about risk profiling. And that, again, I think that comes from the early maturity, the immaturity of the whole Kubernetes space. I mean, in like 5-10 years, it'll probably be fine.
Yeah. And Michael, as you're already wearing this Tanzu shirt, this logo, I believe, says Tanzu, right?
That's right.
Think policy is a big key to security. And I think a policy is what Tanzu is all about in many ways, to provide that governance layer and ultimately security, right?
Yeah. And I think, I was just looking over, I saw you were covering quite a lot, the VMware Explorer we had last week. And I was kind of reminding myself of it. And, I started at Pivotal like 5-6 years ago. I should do the math one day. And like, I was thinking it's always been about two things. One is basically developer productivity, just like doing stuff faster. But really, like when you look over a lot of what the Tanzu portfolio has evolved to, which is based on what enterprises need, it really is like, yeah, we want to let developers do developer stuff, but make sure they're doing it within the proper rules and the frameworks. And I was just thinking, like, no one says enterprise architecture anymore, but within the enterprise architecture that we've established, right? The governance, and like, just as with when we were talking about security, right? I think that I have this theory that whenever you like replace, if you look at the entire stack to run an application, like whenever you start replacing the infrastructure layer, to use an old Joel Spolsky term, right? Like you have this leaky abstraction all the way up to the top. Like you just sort of like have to redo everything, which can be kind of tedious. But I think what you see now, again, is as more and more, and the studies you do and that we've done with the State of Kubernetes survey, and everyone does, right? Like there is more usage of Kubernetes as the platform you run your applications on in just like large organizations. So you start to see more need for governance and controls, or just like being normal, as people in those organizations would put it.
Yeah, I think those were pretty good last words, Michael. Thank you very much. This is really all about having lots and lots of buckets with holes that you don't know where they are. And you just need a policy layer and guardrails on top of that. And yeah, that's Kubernetes security. It's really that easy. Thank you very much for your time, Michael.
Absolutely.